Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Lovins of the law firm Lovins Trosclair, where we do personal injury cases, but we try them from a personal responsibility angle. I am delighted to have with me today my friend and guest, Rob Henneke. He is the General Counsel at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and a esteemed and accomplished litigator for freedom in various areas of the law. And we're going to be talking about all things coronavirus. Rob, welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Michael, thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me. It's going to be a great discussion today.
So I agree it's going to be a great discussion, but since we are in this bizarro time, you and I are both doing our duties by staying home, and so are the rest of our family. So if you hear some background noise, I'm going to blame it on Rob. He can blame it on me, and we'll let the listener try to figure out who's at fault.
Rest assured, we're appropriately socially distanced.
So, in our lifetimes, and I don't know if it's ever happened in American history, we've had pandemics before, but I don't know if ever in American history there has been virtually a nationwide, that's an overstatement at this point, but a nationwide order for everyone to stay home and mass numbers of businesses to just completely shut down operations. And so what we want to talk about today is how do we navigate this, and how do we even develop some sort of a framework for thinking through it? And so neither Rob nor I are medical professionals, nor are we economists. However, the people who are ultimately making these decisions are also not economists and not medical health professionals, but we're hoping they're going to be relying on them pretty heavily. So I guess, first of all, Rob, how would you suggest that public policy officials try to navigate taking in all of the information to make decisions on information that is imperfect, to say the least?
It is imperfect, but I think that we need to have quite a bit more transparency among the elected officials, specifically at the local level, that are entering these shelter in place, these stay at home orders, which themselves have been very, very damaging to the local economies within that area. And when you're talking about local economies the size of Houston, or the size of Dallas, or the size of Austin, those are massive, massive areas where you're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers and many businesses. And, just any one of those economic centers has the potential to drag down the economy of, Texas. And as Texas goes, so goes the nation. To look at this, there is, and I'll say first, there is a constitutional basis for government to be able to be taking emergency action in times of this public health epidemic. There's case law that supports the government powers to do so. But as you and I both know, these orders are infringing upon people's civil liberties. These orders are infringing upon people's fundamental rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. And at its core, in order for government to be able to do that, the government action has to be narrowly tailored and least restrictive. And so what you need to see is a marrying between the basis for the decisions by the governmental officials with the action that's taken allegedly in just justification. Government officials need to walk the walk for the talk that they're talking, and I don't think you're seeing that right now. To the extent that governmental officials are reacting based on a lack of data or on a worst case scenario that they don't know is necessarily true or not, they need to tell us, because there are, I think, two equal sides of this discussion. Certainly, there is the emergency need to protect public health, but there is also the concern about what the long-term effects of this situation is going to be in terms of employment, in terms of prosperity, in terms of people being able to find work, in terms of our economy. And it's not an either or choice. In fact, it can't be an either or choice. If we only put our focus onto battling the pandemic and completely disregard the effects upon the economy, then when we pivot back to reopening America, we're going to find it in very bad shape. Now, of course, if we ignore the coronavirus epidemic and just put focus into restarting the economy premature, then we could exacerbate this public health crisis. But there needs to be a balance. And I think that that's a large lesson of this, is the need for elected officials to be precise and deliberate in what they're doing to strike that appropriate balance.
So would you say that there should be at least some shelter-in-place orders across the country?
I can't say that. I think what you're seeing, and certainly with a nation as diverse as we are, what may be the correct action for New York City, and given the fact that we saw today that the Navy hospital ship pulled into New York Harbor and that they are looking at building emergency hospital bed space in Central Park. Last I saw, I think, approximately half of the nation's coronavirus positive cases are in New York. So New York has definitely gotten out of control in terms of dealing with the quarantine of that. But I think you need to have a rational response by government officials to the threat. And I'll take, for example, let's look at Austin. The mayor of Austin has issued a stay-at-home order, but is not enforcing that order, and has also written so many exceptions and loopholes and ambiguities into that order that it's basically up to anyone to decide for themselves whether they feel that they're restricted by that order or not. And what you've seen is a large segment of the Austin population seemingly continue to go on their ordinary day, as if nothing's happening. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people have been put out of work. Unemployment is skyrocketing, and you have persons, I think, that have been laid off who probably have a legitimate beef in saying, why did I lose my job if everyone else gets to go about their normal daily business? So we do need to have some patience and some expectation that our elected officials have better access to timely information than we do. But again, it needs to go back to the balance. I mean, I would say that if the city of Austin's concern is that Austin is about to be the next Italy or the next New York City, then that is a crisis. Then we need to lock down the city. We need to quit having people hiking or running around the jogging track on Town Lake, or going down to the Greenbelt, or perusing the household appliance aisle at Walmart. I mean, we need to have a serious response to do this. The mayor's order purports that emergency exists, but then it allows everyone to go along their daily business. So there's a disconnect there. Now, look, if the city does not think that we are on the verge of that type of crisis that you're seeing in other states or other countries, well, then let's pull back. Then let's have a less draconian order that still encourages social distancing, that encourages people to self-quarantine, that directs resources towards healthcare providers and also towards assisting people who are at risk because of their age or because of other types of medical conditions. Let's continue to have large public events canceled for the time being. And, we can have that type of response. But I think it begs the question of, for policymakers, especially those that are issuing these stay-home orders, which is it? If you see that this is a crisis that requires you to order everybody to go home, then you have to make sure that happens. And if it's not, then take the pressure off of the local economy by allowing, more individuals and businesses to kind of make their own best judgment.
Have we heard anything? Well, actually, let's go to this first, because for those listeners who don't know, Rob and I both live in Austin, which he's just been talking about. Have other cities been approaching it in the same way that they seem to be here, which is saying that there's a shelter-in-place rule or order, and nobody's supposed to be going out, but then ignoring the fact that everybody is ignoring the shelter-in-place order? Are other cities doing that, or are they more serious when they issue their shelter-in-place orders?
I mean, here in Texas, I think that that's a common characteristic. I saw an article here recently that was discussing how Cabela's, which is a big box sporting goods store, the Cabela's down outside of San Antonio or inside San Antonio, has continued to stay open because it's interpreted the San Antonio order as allowing it to continue to operate. The San Antonio order allows basically grocery stores to remain in operation, which it should. Yes, makes sense. But Cabela says, hey, we sell camping meals. We sell, freeze-dried food. So we're a food retailer, and so therefore we can stay open. Well, that's ridiculous. And there needs to be a response by city officials when you have businesses that are clearly not following either the letter or the spirit of the law. You have a disconnect, for example, among the construction industry. Here in Austin has closed basically all of the active large construction sites in the city. But the construction industry has validly pointed to the fact that in other cities, Houston, Dallas, for example, those types of construction projects are allowed to continue to operate. Now, on the complete flip side of that, though, I mean, you saw today where Maryland, the governor of Maryland, has ordered everyone to go home, to stay home, and the only exceptions are to get food or to get medical attention. So we'll see if that ends up being enforced by that government. But that's certainly a much more severe response that we've seen so far here in Texas.
So a personal example. So today, again, for folks who aren't in Austin, it's raining here today. One of the things, I think this is actually specifically exempted from the Austin shelter-in-place order, but landscaping companies and lawn mowing and so forth, that can carry on. And so they were supposed to come do my lawn today because I'm too much of a wimp to do my own lawn anymore. But under Governor Hogan's order, that would, it seems clearly be shut down. And then and I'm not health expert enough to know if that should be shut down or not. It seems to me that you can do that. For one, you're outside, which from my understanding, it's safer outside than inside. And you don't have to be close to anybody to do just basic lawn maintenance. How do we deal with, if we say nobody can leave their house, lots of people use landscape services now and lawn mowing services. How do we deal with things as simple as, if we're going to be here for weeks, my lawn's going to be a jungle?
Well, I mean, Michael, you can borrow my lawnmower anytime.
Gosh, I'd have to come over there to get it. or you'd have to bring it over here. Either way, one of us is going to be breaking the law, and I don't want to go to jail for my lawn.
But I think part of the policy, what's intriguing about this is that, if you had the merger of the assertion of power with the enforcement of that power, then you would bring public opinion into play as a pushback against the exercise of governmental power. I mean, right now, part of, where I feel sympathetic to, as I mentioned, are the tens of thousands of people here in Austin who have lost their jobs, who are worried about how they're going to pay rent on April 1st. But look around and see that, a lot of people in Austin are treating this, period of work from home as an extended spring break.
Yeah.
Now, if, everyone was required to have that type of shared sacrifice, then I think as long as the emergency was reasonably evident to the public would understand. But when people looked around and thought that, government had gone too far, or maybe that the crisis had passed, if it was impacting their personal lives, you would start to see growing dissatisfaction and calls for, the government to loosen restrictions. But as long as there's no shared sacrifice, then there's really no disruption to, I think, the majority of, or a certain large number of individuals. And so that lets government off of the hook in terms of being able to have these very, omnibus type orders and to make themselves feel like they've done something, but without having to pay the cost in terms of public opinion, the political cost from actually following through with what they say is necessary.
So just late last week, if I remember right, although late last week was 2 days ago, and it seems like it was a month ago, as much as things have been evolving and changing. But Congress passed and President Trump signed this stimulus bill, rescue bill, whatever you want to call it. It's 1,000+ pages of law put together in a matter of 10 days. What do you have to say in terms of how helpful, how unhelpful, how much it's just a waste of money that's not actually going to help, it's not enough, all those different possibilities? What's your take on that bill?
I'm very disappointed with our federal policymakers, who have now passed 3 massive spending emergency bills that seemingly have zero connection to addressing the immediate needs of our country. Again, I think that policymakers in D.C. are under a panic to make it appear as if they are, quote, doing something. And that something is just to basically throw, the kitchen sink into 1,000 pages of legislation and then vote on it without anybody reading it. And here's where I'm specifically critical about what I'm seeing that passed in this third emergency spending bill, this $2 trillion spending bill. And let's put that into context. In the year 2020, this $2 trillion spending bill that was just passed is bigger than the combined total discretionary spending budget of every federal agency in our nation. And,
Wow.
And we're not lacking for small federal government. We have a big federal government. We just have spent more than every federal agency in the United States has the discretion to spend this year in their budget. And let's note, they still have that spending from the continuing resolutions.
Mm-hmm.
The bill that just got passed is bigger than any of the TARP bailouts from 2008 or 2009. And look, the immediate need, we don't want to create a welfare state. I mean, you had all this debate about writing checks, sending checks to every American.
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrible idea. I mean, it was a terrible idea in 2008 and 2009 when it happened, but the rationale at that point is not applicable to here, because back then the goal of that was to stimulate the economy, quote unquote, by encouraging people to take that money and go spend it in the marketplace. The need now is people have, especially a lot of
Okay, folks, we're back after a little technical difficulty there when we unceremoniously dropped off. Rob, you were talking about the stimulus bill and the things that are wrong with it and the massive size of it. So to the extent you remember where you were in your answer, pick up where you left off if you can.
Right. So we've just passed the third emergency spending bill, which in and of itself is larger than all of the discretionary spending for the federal government for the year 2020. And to me, it doesn't match with the immediate economic need. I mean, the purpose of this is not to have coronavirus drive the United States into a welfare state. And a lot of the focus on the stimulus bill had been on the checks that were going to be given to the American citizens, that was a bipartisan agreement, although the amount seemed to be a level of negotiation. And conceptually, it fails. I mean, it's not unprecedented. In 2008, 2009, when you had the TARP bailouts, you did have the government issue these checks to the American people. And it was a terrible idea then. It's a terrible idea now. But the justification for it was different. Back in 08, 09, reportedly that money was dispersed back to Americans so that they would spend it as a way of stimulating the economy. But here, the big problem is that, hundreds of thousands of people have been put out of work. Unemployment claims are spiking. People are worried about paying their rent.
Oh,
and, for as long as this is, the state of Virginia just announced that its stay home order will extend through June 2nd. The $1,200, per individual of, who makes less than $75,000 is not going to get them back on their feet.
No,
and
not even close.
Nor is it going to be delivered in a timely way. They're predicting best case that this money won't reach individuals for another 3 weeks. At which time have they missed their rent payment?
Right.
Are they struggling to purchase groceries? I mean, does this even dig them out of the hole that they'll be in at that point in time, let alone put them on their feet? It was Bernie Sanders who objected to this because, he wanted the government to be issuing this amount of money every month to Americans. And while, of course, that would be absurd, it kind of makes the point that a single issue check from the government is not going to be, sufficient to take, a huge percentage of the workforce that's immediately put out of work and allow them to remain solvent. I think the opportunity is quickly passing, but the immediate need was for and is for liquidity.
Yeah.
Businesses are not happy about having to close and lay off all of their employees. Up until a few weeks ago, I mean, the American economy has been booming.
Yeah.
Unemployment's been low. Businesses have been growing and thriving, and that just got, ground to a halt immediately. But the proper response is not to just issue massive debt in the form of individual payments to Americans. We need to be using our resources to allow access to liquidity and to give businesses access to, zero interest debt and, kind of stop work insurance opportunities so that they can ride this out without liquidating their workforce or closing shop. And that's not what's happening. I mean, I would have much rather seen a smaller package that would have immediately allowed businesses who need it to borrow for zero interest amount for to pay back over a period of time, to allow those businesses that have a emergency shortage in capital to be able to have access to those funds, to be able to stay open, to float their employees for a while. And rather than, individual checks cut to Americans, I think a much better response would be, to expand unemployment benefits for persons who do find themselves to be displaced. But we have to have the goal of keeping businesses open, keeping people employed, and keeping our economy functioning while we deal with the emergency disruption of this health crisis. And I don't think that what DC is doing right now accomplishes that.
So both you and I generally come from I suppose we'd call it conservative political perspective. And we're generally skeptical of the government intervening in the economy under normal circumstances. How much do you see? Obviously, this is not normal circumstances, but how much does it justify government intervention and just flat out redistribution of wealth? I'm not even sure I'm comfortable with that term, because it's not normal circumstances. Normally, we're fighting against redistribution of wealth, but it's almost redistribution of losses. Is there a philosophically conservative, consistent way to say this is the exception to the rule and government needs to get massively involved?
Well, government is already massively involved, and that's part of the problem with, the ability of businesses to function. You're seeing, a renaissance of policymakers who are responding to the coronavirus crisis by coming in and cutting regulations or suspending regulations that are freeing up the healthcare industry and other industries to be able to continue to function, or to be able to generate a lot of needed products especially for healthcare, like face masks and ventilators and so forth. It really kind of shows you how much government gets in the way, given that we're having to release these regulations to be able to deliver the products and services that are needed for people to not die. But here, I mean, look, generally the government, especially the federal government's good at two things: spending massive amounts of money and mobilizing massive amounts of manpower. And that's not really where our policymakers are playing to their strengths. Now, we are mobilizing manpower. You are seeing the president direct the military to get involved. You saw the Navy hospital ship deployed to New York.
Mm-hmm.
You're also seeing some mobilization of state National Guardsmen and stuff. But what could have been done is to immediately free up the capital that's needed for businesses to continue to exist. We could have suspended the payroll tax and allow businesses to take that money and use it to keep their employees employed, or to use that to keep their businesses open. You could have had, immediate access to stop work insurance, or to, business to be able to access credit at zero interest or something like that. Instead, we're just dumping money into businesses and spending a tremendous amount of money where there's no connection to how that's going to keep us operating. It really just shows how broken our system of government is. For example, the same week that the Congress includes a $25 million appropriation to the Kennedy Center in this third stimulus bill, which is not necessary to keep our economy opening. But the same week that Congress gives the Kennedy Center $25 million in the spending bill, today the Kennedy Center laid off the symphony.
Are you serious? I did not hear that. That's insane.
Yeah, they fired the symphony. They said that they need that $25 million to pay for executive staff salaries, and that without selling tickets, they don't need to have the symphony on the payroll.
Well, yeah, of course you don't need to have the symphony on the payroll if you're not selling tickets, but that's the whole point of giving you money, you dopes.
I know,
isn't it?
I mean, not just a few dollars.
I know.
I mean,
I'm yelling at the one who's agreeing with me, but one of the most basic things that most everybody has to deal with is a rent or a mortgage payment. It would be nice if we could magically push pause on that. If not for everybody, because frankly, I'm in my business, I can operate almost without interruption under stay-at-home, shelter-in-place orders. So I'm not really saying everybody necessarily has to have their rent payments or mortgage payments hit pause. But there are huge numbers of people for whom that's just going to be an unbearable burden. Is there a way, does government have the power at local, state, or federal level to require both residential and commercial landlords to essentially hit pause on the payment requirements, and maybe in the instance of a mortgage, tack it on to the end of the mortgage if necessary? I'm not sure what you do in the instance of leases. A, does the government have the power at any level to do that? And B, whether it does or not, is it a good idea? Or is there a better way to fix that problem?
Well, there's probably good and bad ideas. And I'll start with the bad idea. I mean, last week, the city of Austin passed an ordinance that prohibits landlords from initiating any eviction proceedings against tenants in the city of Austin, residential or commercial. Now, let's keep in mind, the Supreme Court of Texas has already entered an order that has suspended any eviction hearings from happening. But what the city of Austin order did was went further and prohibited landlords from even giving a notice of late rent or notice of default or something like that, unless there were some very egregious type situations. I don't think it's constitutional. I don't think the government can come in and rewrite state law and also, set aside a private contract between an individual and a business. So I think there's going to be many examples of ways that government reacts to this that's going to be unlawful or unconstitutional, and I think also unfair to property owners who, probably want to make things work with their tenants if they have good tenants and, weren't rushing to the courthouse to kick people out that had just lost their jobs. So it's an unfair characterization. I mean, you could look at, lending rules and mortgage rules and, allow people to, refinance, waive the fees involving refinancing, or, restructuring debt to be able to lessen the current need for capital by a landlord in times of, having a disruption by a tenant. Now, Part of that is in the business of being a property owner. But I don't think the government should do, a whole lot more than that, with the exception that taxes again comes into play. I think a great opportunity for government to really alleviate the burden of the current crisis is to look at, and this applies from the federal, the state, to the local level, is to look at the burden that it is placing upon individuals and businesses just by virtue of its own funding itself through taxes. Texas has a high property tax system that funds most local government. So, to the extent that you have a property owner, landlord, that may be put into a pinch because they've lost their tenants, residential or commercial, a big part of the pinch they're in is going to be due to their upcoming tax bill, which certainly policymakers could probably help them, in that way, more so than, exacerbating the spending issue by, having even further bailouts at the local level, or trying to come in and stop, property owners from being able to have control of their property, which is really only going to exacerbate the problem down the road, when, anyone who's told now that you don't have to pay rent at some point is going to have to come up with that money. So, I think I would really put it into, government's role should be in cutting its spending immediately in order to bank current budgeted funds for future needs, and then looking at cutting taxes so that the burden on property owners is less, and at the same time, probably loosening some of its regulatory requirements to allow people to improve or make repairs or do other types of capital projects with their real estate. They may, have the opportunity to do, given that there's a lull in their business, which may just normally take months to even get the permits to proceed forward.
What would you think of, instead of just in an authoritarian sort of way saying, okay, all landlords and mortgage companies have to push pause on payments due for either everyone or people who lose their jobs or whatever? What about and I think this may have been done somewhat in the federal legislation that was passed, but interest-free or very low-interest loans to landlords, both commercial and residential, who do not evict and do not foreclose on people who've lost their jobs and thus their ability to continue making payments as a result of these shutdowns.
Yeah. I mean, you could look at that. You could look at incentivize, to have property owners continue to cooperate with their tenants, to the extent that you could, maybe deduct missed rent payments from your future tax obligations or something like that. That could be an incentive for landlords to do that. But I think you also can't go too far into having a government takeover of private property and private business. I mean, part of what strikes to me about this, all of the bailout discussion, and certainly we are in an unusual time, but it's not the first and only time that there's been an economic type downturn. And I know if you are, a household like you and I both have, if you're faced with, a month that, you may come up a little bit short, well, then your choices are usually limited to, cutting household expenses, putting some bills on the credit card, or, potentially, taking some kind of short-term loan, or going to savings, to make up for what you need. And, I think a lot of businesses in typical business times are expected to do that. We shouldn't throw all of those expectations out the window and just go to the government as the solution. And that's one of the reasons, Michael, why I come back to, I really think the solution should be in having, access to credit, having expanded unemployment benefits available for people to reach out and take opportunities of those if they need them. But there should be, consequences in doing so, not punishments, not negative consequences, nothing more onerous than you got to pay the money back at some point. But at least, not just, a way I think that would, disincentivize businesses that have cash reserves or are currently able to operate from accessing a bunch of money they don't need, or, otherwise recouping a windfall when we really want to help are the ones who have been put out of work or about to be put out of work. And the 47% of, businesses in our nation are small businesses.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are really getting hit hard. Let's make the tools available for those that need them to be able to get assistance. And then let's have everyone else that has the means currently to ride this out, let them do so on their own. I think that's the proper balance.
So last thing before I let you go, just in the last few days, my congressman, and I think someone you know fairly well, Chip Roy, I forget if he wrote a piece or was quoted in a piece saying that the federal government needs to give a date certain on which things are going to open back up. From what I read, he didn't say exactly what the date should be, which is that's a tougher question. Do we need a date certain and we say, okay, on X date, things are opening up? I can understand it might be, okay, on date X, these things are opening up, and then on date Y, these other things are opening up until everything's back up and going. In your view, is it better to have specific dates, or are there certain metrics related to the virus or maybe economic things? And we say, okay, when we have, when cases are at this number, or when we have a magic bullet that we can just give everybody a pill and they're automatically over the coronavirus. How do we go about reopening and letting the public know this is when it's going to happen, so they have something they can count on instead of this eternal limbo that it feels like right now?
Right. And that, to your last point, I get the point that Congressman Roy is making is, we don't know, or whenever this thing's over, are really not acceptable answers for the government to be given in light of the incredible exercise of power that the government is asserting right now, that are putting people out of work and closing jobs and kind of just taking over our nation in terms of this crisis. Part of the problem certainly is and has been the lack of data and the lack of testing. That has, I think, resulted in policymakers today making decisions based on what the status quo was a month ago.
Yeah.
Instead of what we need, which is policymakers to have good information to be making decisions today based on what they are able to accurately and reasonably predict will be the status quo a month from now in the future. That's when we're really going to start turning this, is when we could start being proactive instead of reactive. And when we are able to get to that point, then we need to have some benchmarks in place that, allow us to tie to loosening of these restrictions and allowing business to operate more freely. And in the interim, we need to have, I think, going back to one of the things I said at the very beginning of our great discussion today, transparency and honesty from our elected officials about what information they're lacking to be able to get to that point to have dates certain. Because right now it seems like policymakers are making decisions based on fear and uncertainty, and that's chaotic. And I think that is causing unnecessary damage. Certainly the number of coronavirus cases every day is rising, and that's concerning. Certainly the number of coronavirus deaths is rising every day, and that is very concerning. But we don't have a sense yet whether our government has a handle on this. And if they do, then there needs to be a lot more detail and justification for the decisions that are being made. So to Congressman Roy's point, yes, we need to have goals and to give people expectations and a point to plan for on when they can expect that we will start moving back towards a sense of normalcy. And we absolutely should be able to determine those goals based on certain benchmark expectations. And we should be able to quantify those benchmark expectations based on accurate data. So I think it walks in that direction. Are we at a point right now where we can say with certainty that, a specific date is the date that we can, turn this back around? No. But I think walking through the steps that I just outlined and having that discussion with the American people, with businesses, with individuals needs to happen and is not happening right now. And so all we know as Americans is kind of this status of living hour to hour, just waiting for the next pronouncement of government and then having to deal with whatever disruption that's going to result. And that is not the way to govern. Certainly not fair to the American people, nor is that really a long-term plan for success in dealing with this crisis.
Yeah, and I think the uncertainty is creating as much trouble at this point as the virus itself. People who need to make decisions and need to be able to plan are sitting in this limbo state. And the longer that uncertainty builds, the greater the temptation is to make, I was going to say to make poor choices, but you don't know if they're poor choices or not because you're just in this limbo, and that just keeps hurting the economy worse and worse. And just it drives things as much as the virus.
Yeah, well, Michael, we have the experts who should be able to decide benchmarks that will result in better informed choices. As I said, right now our policymakers are making decisions based on data from a month ago, because now we've just only been able to, to look back that far. They're saying that hadn't been enough testing done or there hasn't been enough. Okay, well, how much is enough? What's the representative sample before our medical health experts and our government will be able to kind of apply that statistical model to the population and then start making decisions based on that, data.
Right.
We absolutely, as Americans, are entitled to demand that, and that is something that is within the portfolio and the ability of government to be able to deliver. Otherwise, we're just going to flounder around and fail through this into, I think a catastrophic depression, and that's scary. That is real scary. We can't really appreciate what that means, but there's some real damage being done on this. And I think one of the takeaways is the need to have, better informed decisions that are much more precise in addressing the problems at hand, rather than just throwing everything at the wall and hoping that enough sticks to keep this propped up.
My guest today has been Rob Henneke, General Counsel at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Michael, great discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer, I'm Michael Lovins, and we will see you next time. This episode of the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast is brought to you by my law firm, Lovins Trosclair, where we use the civil justice system to hold people responsible for irresponsible choices when those irresponsible choices cause serious injuries and sometimes even death. We are personal injury trial lawyers, but we approach our cases a little differently than a lot of other lawyers who do the same basic kind of work. I really, really hope that you do not need us, but if you do need us, please call us before evidence gets lost. You can call us at 512-535-1649. Tell us you heard about us on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can also go to our website on the interwebs at www.ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Lovins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. Thank you for listening to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. If you like what you've heard or if you've learned something interesting, please do me a favor and rate the show on iTunes. It really does help. You can get more information about this show, including the show notes, at my personal website, michaellovins.com. And now I have to do some disclaimers where I say stuff that you already knew, but I got to say it anyway so that I keep the state bar happy. This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make me your lawyer or you my client. Neither does it make any of my guests your lawyer. If you want me to be your lawyer, contact my office. If I can represent you, we will execute a written contract stating the specific terms under which I agree to represent you. Did you really need me to tell you that? I really, really hope not. Also, I am not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization as a personal responsibility lawyer because they don't know what that is. They also have not certified me in any other areas of specialty that they actually do recognize. I think that does it for disclaimers. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast, I am Michael Lovins. We'll see you next time.